So in this lecture, we will explore the linkages between national savings, investment, and trade. Now to motivate the ideas why we are interested in this, let me show you this article. So the title of this article is How much US debt does China own? The United States debt load has risen substantially since the start of the millennium, raising concern to some of the country's long-term financial health. But who owns all this debt? A nation's debt consists of the total amount of bonds it has issued or sold. The US debt sits at over $21 trillion as of June 2018, and the largest investors in US treasuries are other governments and central banks. So, China's large position in US treasuries. China, which owned an estimated 1.18 trillion in US treasuries, is the number one investor among foreign governments according to the April 2018 figures released by the US Treasury. This amounts to over 21% of the US debt held overseas and about 7.2% of the United States total debt load. Why these big numbers aren't necessarily a problem? Now, before we go into all this, the important question is this: why China is holding so much of US debt? Or to put it differently, why Chinese government are willing to lend to the United States government? As we all know, US runs huge budget deficits. And what is budget deficits? It's a situation where government spendings are more than government revenues or taxes. Now, since government spendings are more than government revenues, as a result, US government needs to borrow. And the biggest lender is China, or they have lent us already $1.1 trillion. So we'll try to explore this situation and we'll try to understand why Chinese government is willing to lend to us or why we need to borrow those money. Now to understand this concept, first I need to introduce you to certain additional concepts which is called national savings. So national savings is summation of private savings and public savings. Now question is, what is a private savings? Private savings is nothing but your total income subtracted from that consumption and taxes. Remember, this big Y is your output, C is your consumption, and T is your taxes. So output, or also called GDP or national income. So if we take out consumption taxes from national income, what we get is private savings, that which also means the money that saved by people like you and me as private individuals and firms. What is public savings? Public saving is money saved by the government. And what is government's source of revenue? Is taxes. And from this, we just subtract the government expenditure, which we discussed in our GDP chapter. So whatever money is left is called public savings. Now government runs a budget surplus. If taxes are greater than government expenditure, and budget deficit if taxes are less than government expenditure. So US government at this point of time is running budget deficit. Another point I would like to mention is that national savings equal to investment. Why this is so? So let's try to understand it. So national savings is equal to private savings plus public savings. And we all know private savings are Y minus C minus T. Public savings are T minus G. If we subtract it, what we get? Y minus C minus G, which is nothing but equal to investment. Remember, Y equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. And as a result, your investment is equal to Y minus C minus G assuming your net export is equal to zero, which is a negligible amount if you look at the national income accounts. Having said that, what we'll do next, I'll bring in the external sector in next slide. To understand this, we'll need to understand the supply and demand of financial capital. So who is demanding financial capital and who are supplying financial capital. But the point you should keep in mind is this: national savings equal to investment, and national savings is equal to private savings and public savings. So now let's get into the supply and demand of financial capital. So there are two main sources of supply of financial capital in the US economy. These are savings by individuals and firms, which is also private savings, or big S, that we have done. That means money saved by people like you and me. And also is the inflow of financial capital from foreign investors, which is equal to the trade deficit, or imports minus export. Now why this is so? Remember, your balance of payment is equal to current account plus capital account, and current account includes your exports minus imports, and if this is negative, implies capital account has to be greater than zero or positive. So in this particular case, so demand for capital also comes from the fact that if we import more than we export, because we need to pay for that, and for that we need money. Now on the other hand, there are two sources of demand for financial capital in the US economy. These are private sector investment. As we said, national saving has to be investment. These are the people who want to invest, start a new factory, build a new home. And also demand for capital comes from the government sector if they are running a deficit. If government runs a budget deficit, they need money, and since they need money, they need to borrow. And remember the article I showed you where China is the biggest lender to the United States government? That's why US goes out and borrow money from countries like China. Now let's put it together. So in an economy, we all know your supply needs to equal demand. So supply of financial capital has to be equal to demand for financial capital. And as I showed you, supply of financial capital is nothing but this is your private savings, this is your trade deficit, this is your investment, and this is your budget deficit run by the government. So in an ideal world, these two things has to be equal, because these are accounting identities. Money you can only pay for if you have received it from somewhere. So I'll try to rearrange these things a little bit. So we'll look at the case of trade deficit. So I'll just rearrange it, and it's a simple algebraic manipulation. If you see it, I can write your trade deficit So trade deficit as the difference between your private investment minus savings minus budget deficit. That's your So here's an interesting fact. And the fact is this: if we are running a trade deficit and if we don't save enough, this is savings by us, and our government runs huge deficits, only way we can pay for it is by bringing foreign money. So the bottom line is, the only way that domestic investment can exceed domestic saving if capital is flowing into a country from abroad. The connection of domestic saving investment to the trade balance explains why economists view the balance of trade as fundamentally a macroeconomic phenomenon. So all these noises or news about why we import so much from China, or why Chinese government is buying up so much of our treasury bills or government debt, and the reason lies with the fact that we are actually spending more. Mind you, if you spend more, if you consume more, that means you are not saving enough. And if you are not saving enough, that means you need the money from somewhere. And if you don't have enough saving, what do? You borrow. And that's the reason we are borrowing. So same thing we can do with a trade surplus. What is the trade surplus? When exports are more than imports. So in this equation, it is a trade surplus because exports minus import, trade surplus. This is your private savings. This is your budget surplus minus investment. And if you are running a trade surplus, that means the private savings plus budget surplus should be greater than your investment, which means that in this scenario, domestic savings is higher than domestic investment. As a result, extra financial capital will need to be invested abroad. And since in China, if you look at, they're running huge savings and huge budget surpluses, as a result, they have surplus money which they need to invest somewhere in this world, and the place they invest in the United States government bond. Why they invest in United States government bond? Because that's the safest form of investment in the whole world at this point of time. Finally, so there's an intrinsic connection between how we trade and the amount we borrow. And that's explained through this fundamental equation where your budget or trade deficit, this is your trade deficit, this is your government surplus, this is your saving, and this is your investment. And all of them are interconnected. For example, in this particular table, if suppose your investment increases, your savings do not change, your government surplus or deficit do not change, only way it can work out if we have imports minus exports are rising. Okay, same thing if there's no change in investment but your savings is increasing, only way it can work out if imports minus exports must fall, and so on. So always remember this, all borrowing or running a trade deficit are intrinsically related. So to an extent, it's our behavior that's forcing us to borrow more. Now, should we save more? That's also a topsy-turvy area, because more savings means less consumption. Less consumption means you are not spending enough. If you're not spending enough, that means somebody is not producing enough. That means it's going to cost us jobs. So we will be taking up all those issues as we move on in this course.